If you were to walk the narrow streets of a Renaissance town in Italy, France, or England, the smell of freshly baked bread would reach you long before you reached the bakery itself. Bread was not just food, it was survival. For most households, bread made up the majority of their daily calories, sometimes as much as 3/4 of their diet. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, everyone ate bread. But because it was so central, bread could not be left entirely to the freedom of the marketplace. The size and weight of a loaf were matters of law. In the Renaissance, bread was measured almost as carefully as gold. Across Europe, governments issued rules known as bread assizes, which dictated how much bread a baker had to give for a certain price. In England, for example, the assize of bread and ale had been established as early as the 13th century, and it continued to shape daily baking in the Renaissance. Its logic was simple: if the price of wheat rose, the loaf got smaller; if the price of wheat fell, the loaf grew larger. In this way, the price of bread remained constant, while its size shifted with the harvest. The result was that bakers lived under constant scrutiny. Officials called bread weighers, or assize men, visited bakeries, lifting loaves onto scales, checking their weight against official tables. If a loaf was too light, the baker risked punishment. Sometimes the fine was monetary, but in other cases, bakers were humiliated in public. In some cities, a cheating baker could be tied to a cart and paraded through the streets. His underweight loaves hung around his neck as proof of his dishonesty. And yet, for all the regulations, mistakes happened. Grain varied in quality, ovens baked unevenly, scales could be faulty, a baker might add just a little too much yeast, puffing up the loaf with air rather than substance. Or perhaps he might keep back a handful of flour in hard times, trying to make his family's supply stretch a little further. The difference between honest survival and dishonest cheating was not always easy to see. This made the bakery both a trusted and suspicious place. Customers needed bakers, but they also doubted them. Bakers needed customers, but they feared inspectors. The law stood in the middle, attempting to balance fairness and survival. To be a baker in the Renaissance was to live in the tension between nourishment and regulation. At the same time, bread was more than a legal product. It was a cultural symbol. In Italy, large round loaves, heavy and rustic, reflected the countryside where wheat was grown. In France, long thin loaves hinted at the future baguette. In Germany, darker rye breads carried associations of strength and rural simplicity. Every loaf carried not just weight and price, but meaning. The details could become surprisingly technical. In Florence, bakers had to mark their loaves with distinctive stamps, so inspectors could trace a light loaf back to its source. In London, bread was sorted into grades. White bread, made from fine sifted flour, was more expensive, while brown bread, mixed with bran, was cheaper and intended for the poor. The system of bread weights was published in public places, so even ordinary townspeople could complain if they felt cheated. And yet, for all this regulation, one problem remained unsolved: how could fairness be ensured in a world where nature itself was unpredictable? A year of poor harvests might drive up grain prices, shrinking the size of loaves so much that even honest bakers seemed stingy. A year of abundance could make loaves so large that bakers worried about their own profits. The system relied on constant adjustment, constant vigilance. So, as you picture the streets of a Renaissance town, imagine not just the smell of warm bread, but the invisible weight of law pressing down on every loaf. Each piece of bread was more than food. It was a calculation of flour, labor, justice, and survival. And it leaves us with a question that Renaissance bakers themselves might have asked: was bread truly a gift of the earth? Or had it become a matter of mathematics and law, measured out in ounces and penalties? If you ever wandered through a Renaissance city before dawn, you would have found the baker already at work. Long before the sun rose, bakers lit their ovens, kneaded dough, and prepared loaves for a town that expected bread on its tables each morning. The life of a baker was marked by heat, flour, and fatigue. The ovens were vast brick chambers, heated with bundles of wood until the walls glowed red. Bakers shoveled out the embers, then slid in loaves with long paddles, stacking them row by row. In the half-light of the workshop, shadows of flour dust clung to the walls, and the air was thick with smoke and steam. It was hard, unglamorous work. Kneading dough was heavy labor, and every step mattered. Too little yeast and the bread was dense. Too much and it puffed like a hollow shell. The mixing of flour and water had to be judged by hand, with no precise instruments but experience. A baker's reputation lived or died by these judgments. Customers wanted bread that was not just heavy enough to satisfy the law but soft, flavorful, and satisfying. But even when the bread turned out well, the baker's work was not finished. Inspectors might arrive at any moment. They would lift loaves from baskets, weighing them against official measures. If they found them too light, punishment followed. In some towns, bakers caught cheating could be fined heavily, their ovens sealed, or worse, publicly shamed. Stories circulated of bakers tied to carts and dragged through the streets with their bread displayed as proof of dishonesty. For most bakers, such humiliation was not worth the risk. Yet mistakes were unavoidable. Grain itself was unpredictable. One sack of wheat might be dry and heavy, another damp and light. The price of flour shifted with the harvest, and so the size of loaves had to shift too. Bakers lived in constant negotiation between fairness, survival, and the shifting hand of nature. This tension gave bread a dangerous power. A shortage of grain meant smaller loaves, and smaller loaves meant hungry households. Anger at bakers could spill into riots. In France and Italy, crowds sometimes stormed bakeries, accusing them of hoarding flour or cheating customers. In England, records speak of bread riots, where loaves were seized from shops and redistributed by force. For the poor, bread was life itself, and any sense of injustice could ignite unrest. And yet, despite the risks, the baker was also a figure of trust. Communities depended on their bakers every day. Many customers bought bread on credit, promising to pay at the end of the week. The baker became part merchant, part neighbor, and part guarantor of survival. Families might remember a baker who quietly gave an extra loaf in lean years, just as they remembered those who tried to profit from hunger. Religion, too, gave bread a special weight. In Christian Europe, bread was not only daily food, but also the central symbol of the Eucharist. When a priest lifted the host at Mass, it was bread that became the sign of divine presence. Bakers who provided altar bread had to meet not just legal standards but spiritual ones. To cheat in bread, then, was not only a civic offense but also, in some eyes, a moral failing. The work of a baker thus existed at a crossroads between law and livelihood, between daily survival and divine symbolism. Each loaf carried more than flour and water. It carried weight in the eyes of the town, the church, and the state. And as cities grew, markets expanded, and trade networks widened. One question loomed larger: could the ancient systems of bread regulation continue to keep pace with a world that was becoming ever more complex? By the late Renaissance, the rules surrounding bread had become more than a matter of flour and scales. They had become a symbol of the relationship between rulers and the ruled. To regulate bread was to regulate survival itself. Kings, princes, and city councils all understood this, and their authority often depended on how well they managed the grain supply and enforced fair baking. Bread riots were among the most feared forms of unrest in early modern Europe. They erupted not because people sought political revolution, but because they demanded fairness in their daily bread. A sudden shortage of grain, or a rumor that bakers were cheating, could ignite fury. Markets were stormed, granaries broken open, and loaves seized. Unlike other forms of protest, these riots often ended with bread redistributed among the hungry, almost as if the crowd itself was enforcing the ancient assize. For governments, the lesson was clear: bread was peace. In Florence, officials established the Officio del Grano to oversee the storage and fair distribution of grain. In Paris, authorities monitored bakeries to ensure that loaves remained plentiful. Even in smaller towns, councils intervened, arranging for grain to be imported during lean years to calm tempers. Bread became a political tool, its size and weight a measure of how justly rulers governed. At the same time, the system revealed the growing complexity of urban economies. A loaf of bread was no longer simply baked grain. Its price reflected the success of distant harvests, the cost of transporting flour, the laws of the marketplace, and the expectations of local communities. A peasant in the countryside might bake at home, but a townsman relied on the baker, who in turn relied on the council, who relied on merchants, who relied on ships and wagons. In this way, the weight of a single loaf contained the weight of an entire economic network. This dependence made bread both fragile and powerful. If one part of the chain faltered, a failed harvest in Sicily, a storm delaying grain ships in the Mediterranean, a corrupt merchant hoarding wheat in a warehouse, the effects rippled through the city. Suddenly, loaves shrank, prices wavered, and unrest threatened. To measure bread was therefore not only to measure flour, but to measure the health of society itself. And yet, bread remained deeply personal. For a family, the daily loaf was a marker of routine, comfort, and trust. To break bread together was to affirm community. A baker who delivered fair loaves helped maintain that trust. A ruler who guaranteed grain supplies preserved the fabric of the city. In this sense, bread regulation was not only economic but cultural. It was part of the silent contract that bound people together. As the Renaissance gave way to the early modern era, these contracts were tested. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe saw wave after wave of bread riots, culminating in the French Revolution, where the cry for bread carried as much weight as the cry for liberty. The centuries-old practice of regulating loaf size had not solved hunger, but it had taught people to expect fairness in their daily food. When that fairness failed, they acted. Looking back, the rules about bread may seem tedious. Tables of weights, inspections, punishments, and yet they reveal something profound. Societies survive not only through great battles or royal decrees, but through the steady, daily management of necessities. The loaf of bread, weighed on a scale in a Renaissance bakery, was more than food. It was the foundation of social stability. Today, when you buy bread in a supermarket, its weight is printed clearly on the package, guaranteed by law. We take for granted that the loaf will be as advertised. But this quiet assurance is the descendant of centuries of bakers, inspectors, and townspeople measuring and disputing loaves in smoky Renaissance streets. And it leaves us with one last reflection: if bread, in all its ordinariness, required such careful regulation to keep peace, what does that say about the invisible rules and balances that hold our own societies together today? In the medieval world, when the sun went down, darkness was nearly absolute. There were no street lamps to light the alleys, no electric bulbs to fill rooms with brightness, and no easy way to push back the night. A household's evening depended on fire, hearth flames, torches, and most importantly, candles. Candles shaped the rhythm of daily life. They governed how long a merchant could keep his shop open, how late a monk could copy a manuscript, and how far a family might stretch their conversations into the evening. Yet candles were not all the same. The most common were made from tallow, the rendered fat of sheep, goats, or cattle. These candles smoked heavily, sputtered as they burned, and filled rooms with a greasy smell. They were cheap, and so they lit the homes of the poor and the middling alike. By contrast, beeswax candles were clean, fragrant, and slow burning. Their golden flame was steady, their scent sweet. They were far more expensive, reserved for churches, noble households, and wealthy guildhalls. To burn beeswax was to declare status. This divide in materials created an economy of light. Candle makers became important figures, for they controlled not only a daily necessity, but also a symbol of wealth and piety. In cities across Europe, guilds of chandlers, candle makers, emerged to regulate the trade. They set prices, oversaw apprenticeships, and enforced rules about quality. The guild ensured that candles met standards, so that a tallow candle burned as long as it should, and a beeswax candle carried the weight of its price. The work of a candle maker was both simple and exacting. Fat or wax had to be carefully melted, purified, and poured around wicks. Tallow required repeated straining to remove impurities. Otherwise, the candle would sputter or collapse. Beeswax needed careful heating so it did not scorch. Wicks, often made of twisted flax or hemp, had to be the right thickness, or the flame would gutter. Even something as small as a draft in the workshop could change how a candle formed. The economics of candle making were tied closely to religion. Churches required vast quantities of candles, for mass, for saints' feast days, for vigils and processions. A cathedral might burn through thousands in a single year. The demand gave candle makers steady income, but it also bound them to strict expectations. A candle offered at an altar could not smoke or sputter. It had to be pure and steady, a symbol of devotion as much as a source of light. At the same time, the price of fat and wax rose and fell with the seasons. In years of poor harvest, when animals were slaughtered in greater numbers, tallow might be plentiful. In years when hives thrived, beeswax flowed into markets. But when supplies were tight, candles grew dearer, and the poor suffered most. Some families rationed their candles, snuffing them early to save them for longer winter nights. Others turned back to rushlights, cheap reeds dipped in fat, that burned quickly but poorly. Thus, the humble candle carried the weight of an economy. To burn light was to spend resources, to calculate costs, to balance necessity and luxury. For the medieval candle maker, Every wick dipped in wax was part of a larger system of survival and meaning. And it leaves us with a question: in a world where every flame had to be crafted by hand, how did the economy of candles shape the way people thought about time, labor, and even holiness itself? By the High Middle Ages, candle making was no longer just a craft carried out in kitchens and workshops. It had become a regulated profession. In many towns, chandlers were organized into guilds, associations that protected their trade and enforced their rules. Membership in a guild was both a privilege and a responsibility. To become a full candle maker, one usually began as an apprentice, often at a young age. Years of training followed, learning how to prepare tallow without spoiling it, how to purify beeswax, how to twist and trim wicks, and how to manage the balance between speed and quality in production. When an apprentice finally became a journeyman, he could work for wages, traveling from shop to shop, only after years of experience and often the completion of a masterpiece, a set of candles made to exact guild standards. Could he become a master chandler, entitled to open his own shop and take apprentices of his own? In this way, the guild preserved the knowledge and controlled the flow of new tradesmen into the market. The guild also enforced strict regulations. Candles had to be of a certain weight and quality. A loaf of bread might be weighed in the marketplace, but a candle, too, was subject to scales. Inspectors checked to ensure that candles contained pure fat or wax, not mixed with cheaper materials such as fish oil or suet. A candle that smoked excessively or melted too quickly could draw fines. Dishonest chandlers who tried to stretch their profits by adulterating wax risked expulsion from the guild or worse. Public shame in the marketplace. The church was both customer and overseer. Cathedrals, monasteries, and parish churches consumed enormous amounts of candles, and they demanded the highest quality, especially in beeswax. For religious ceremonies, a candle was not simply a light, it was a symbol of purity, sacrifice, and divine presence. Processions filled with the glow of beeswax candles projected wealth and devotion. A dim or smoky flame was unthinkable at the altar. Thus, chandlers found themselves deeply tied to the rhythms of the liturgical year. Holy days, vigils, and festivals brought sudden surges of demand, while ordinary weeks might be quieter. In towns and villages, candles also carried social meaning beyond the church. Wealthier households burned beeswax to display refinement, while ordinary families relied on tallow. Yet even tallow candles were precious. A household might budget carefully, lighting only one or two at a time in winter evenings. For special occasions, weddings, christenings, funerals, candles were part of the ritual display. In some places, it was customary to offer candles to saints or to burn them for the dead. In these moments, light itself became a currency of remembrance and devotion. Because candles were both necessity and symbol, disputes over their price or quality could cause tension. Just as bakers faced suspicion about underweight loaves, candle makers faced accusations of cheating. Communities depended on them, but they also watched them closely. The guild's role was to prevent such disputes by maintaining standards and ensuring that chandlers lived up to their responsibilities. In this balance, we see how something as small as a candle flame carried layers of meaning: economic, social, and spiritual. To light a room was to reveal the hidden fabric of medieval society. The networks of trade that brought fat and wax, the hands that shaped them, the rules that governed their sale, and the rituals that gave them purpose. And yet, another question lingers. If candles were so tightly bound to daily life and faith, what happened when supply faltered? When wax ran short, or when tallow grew too costly? How did medieval people adapt to the scarcity of something as essential as light? For all their importance, candles were never guaranteed. The medieval economy was fragile, tied to the success of harvests, the health of herds, and the fortune of bees. When one part of this chain failed, the shortage was felt in every home and parish. In years when cattle and sheep were lean, tallow became scarce, driving up the cost of even the humblest candles. When cold springs or disease struck bee colonies, beeswax grew rare and precious, reserved almost entirely for churches and the wealthy. Families adapted in their own ways. The poor turned to rushlights, simple reeds dipped in animal fat that burned quickly, unevenly, and gave off little light. Others relied on oil lamps, fueled by whatever oil was available: olive oil in the Mediterranean, fish oil or whale oil further north. These substitutes were smoky and foul-smelling, but they pushed back the darkness just enough for meals, prayers, or evening tasks. A household without candles managed with the hearth fire carefully tended so that a single flame might be carried from room to room. For communities, shortages created strain. In towns where candles were essential for processions, guilds scrambled to stretch supplies. Some churches accepted tallow where once they demanded beeswax, lowering their standards to ensure that services could still be held. Others rationed candles, reducing the number burned at altars or limiting their use in festivals. In such times, the glow of light was not just a symbol of faith but of resilience, a community adjusting to hardship. These pressures also revealed the interconnectedness of medieval trade. Beeswax, for example, was not only local. Large quantities were imported from Eastern Europe, where vast forests supported beekeeping on a massive scale. Merchants carried wax along trade routes, selling it in bulk to Western cities. A disruption in these routes, war, famine, or bad weather, meant higher prices in distant cathedrals. Tallow, too, depended on herds and slaughterhouses, tying candle making to the rhythms of agriculture and meat consumption. To study candles is therefore to study the medieval economy itself, in miniature. And yet, candles were more than commodities. They were part of cultural memory. To place a candle on a grave was to remember the dead. To burn one before a saint's shrine was to ask for help. To light a single taper in a humble home was to affirm dignity in the face of darkness. Scarcity made candles even more meaningful, because every flame carried the weight of choice to burn now, or to save for later. To give a candle to the church, or to keep it for one's own family. These choices quietly shaped lives as much as the grand decrees of kings and councils. As mechanical clocks would later reshape the rhythms of time, so too would new technologies transform the management of light. In the early modern period, oil lamps improved, and eventually gas and electric lights banished darkness altogether, but the memory of candles remained. Even today, candles mark rituals of mourning, celebration, and devotion. We light them not for necessity but for meaning, echoes of a time when each small flame was an act of survival and a declaration of faith. And so, the strange economy of medieval candle makers leaves us with a reflection, when something as ordinary as light required so much effort, regulation, and trust. Perhaps people understood its value more deeply than we do today. What might we discover about our own lives if we looked at the small, everyday things? Electric bulbs, packaged foods, tap water, as the fragile, carefully managed miracles they truly are. When you imagine the ancient world, you might think of bustling marketplaces, grand temples, or armies marching across distant lands. Yet much of that world would be lost to us without the quiet figures who bent over desks, styluses in hand, copying words line by line. These were the scribes, men and sometimes women whose task was not to build monuments or wage war, but to preserve memory. Their work was slow, painstaking, and often forgotten, but it formed the backbone of ancient knowledge. Scribes worked in many environments. In Mesopotamia, they pressed wedge, shaped signs into damp clay tablets, each stroke a deliberate mark. In Egypt, they unrolled long sheets of papyrus, black and red ink staining the fibers as they recorded hymns, tax records, or medical treatises. In Greece and Rome, scribes used parchment, animal skins carefully prepared to hold ink, where philosophy, law, and poetry were preserved. Across cultures, the rhythm was the same, a hand moving steadily, a mind measuring words, and an eye checking for mistakes. It was not glamorous work. The rooms were dim, lit by oil lamps or the filtered glow of sunlight. Posture was awkward, hours long. Errors were easy to make, a skipped line, a misplaced symbol, a repeated phrase. And errors mattered, because texts were not just stories. They were contracts, laws, scriptures, scientific knowledge, and cultural memory. A mistake in a single word could change a meaning entirely. A treaty could become invalid, a law could be misapplied, or a prayer could be misread. To guard against these dangers, scribes developed a habit that might seem tedious. They counted. In Mesopotamia, colophons, the closing notes at the end of tablets, often listed the number of lines or words, so a reader could check whether the tablet was complete. In Jewish scribal tradition, exacting rules demanded that every letter of the Torah be copied with precision, with word counts and letter counts used as checks. In medieval monasteries, scribes sometimes noted in the margins how many lines they had copied, both for accuracy and as a wary sigh of completion. Counting words was not simply about neatness, it was about trust. A patron who paid for a manuscript needed assurance that the copy matched the original. A community that relied on sacred texts needed to know that no corruption had crept in. Word counts, line counts, and marginal notes were a quiet form of accountability, ensuring that knowledge remained intact through generations of fragile hands. Imagine the concentration required. Hours into copying a text, the scribe's eyes might blur, his hand might cramp, and fatigue might whisper shortcuts. Yet the discipline of counting forced a kind of double awareness, first of the words themselves, and second of their number. It was a safeguard, a way of saying, this work is whole, this work is faithful. But beyond accuracy, there was also a philosophy hidden in the practice. To count every word was to affirm that each word mattered. Nothing was trivial, nothing to be skipped. Every stroke of ink had weight. In a way, the scribe's counting turned language into something physical, measurable, as though words were bricks in the construction of memory. And yet, even with these measures, questions linger. How often did mistakes slip through anyway? How many errors have been carried forward because a wary scribe miscounted, or because a word was so familiar that it went unnoticed when omitted? If the guardians of knowledge themselves sometimes faltered, then what truly have we inherited in the texts we read today? For the ancient scribe, a day was defined by repetition and precision. From the moment the first light of dawn filtered through a window, or, in some regions, the flicker of an oil lamp, the scribe was at work. The desk, often just a simple wooden table angled to reduce strain, was covered with parchment or papyrus. Inkwells sat at the ready, containing black ink made from soot and gum, or iron gall ink that could etch deeply into parchment. A stylus or reed pen was held carefully, its tip shaping the letters in a dance of concentration. The work demanded not only physical endurance but mental focus. Each line had to be exact. The scribe read and reread, copying letter by letter, word by word. Mistakes could be erased on parchment with careful scraping, or on wax tablets by smoothing and rewriting, but these remedies were laborious and left marks. In some cases, an error might render an entire manuscript suspect. Patrons who commissioned copies, whether for government, temple, or wealthy households, expected perfection. Accuracy was a professional necessity. It was also a matter of honor. Scribes often used a variety of techniques to maintain reliability. Word counting was one, but so were colophons, margin notes, and special symbols. In monastic scriptoria, multiple scribes might copy the same text independently, and a master scribe would compare versions, checking for discrepancies. In legal or religious contexts, these redundancies were essential. A missing or miswritten word could have profound consequences. Environmental factors played a significant role in the work. Parchment could expand or contract with humidity. Ink might smudge if the air was too moist. Lighting was variable, often dim and uneven, causing eye strain. In winter, cold could stiffen fingers, while summer heat could warp sheets. Every factor made the meticulous counting of words not merely tedious, but a critical defense against inevitable human error. The work was also socially and economically consequential. In societies where literacy was limited, scribes held a position of influence. They preserved laws, religious texts, tax records, and commercial agreements. A scribe's reliability could affect justice, commerce, and faith. Patrons paid for precision because a small error could lead to disputes, misunderstandings, or even the invalidation of a contract. To count each word, then, was to uphold social stability. Yet the practice of counting also reflected a deeper philosophy. Scribes understood that knowledge is fragile. They recognized that words are the vessels of memory, culture, and power. Each word counted was a safeguard against the erosion of wisdom, a quiet assertion that the present must honor the past. This meticulous attention created not only accurate copies, but a mindset that every detail, no matter how small, carries significance. Even so, uncertainty persisted. No system is perfect, and despite counting, errors slipped through. A misread letter, a missing stroke, a miscopied number could propagate for generations. These tiny flaws remind us that even the most disciplined guardians of knowledge were fallible, and that what survives from the ancient world is only a partial reflection of what once existed. This raises a question that echoes across centuries. If the preservation of knowledge depended so heavily on human diligence and patience, how much has been lost simply because someone's hand grew tired, or their eye wandered for a moment? By the time a scribe completed a manuscript, the work often represented weeks, months, or even years of meticulous labor. Each copied line, each counted word, was a thread in the vast tapestry of civilization, connecting the present to the past. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like boring repetition, scratching ink onto parchment, counting letters, erasing minor mistakes. and starting again. But beneath that quiet monotony lay the foundation of all recorded knowledge, the preservation of human thought, law, religion, and culture. Scribes were aware of the stakes. In ancient Mesopotamia, scribes' records of trade and taxation determined wealth and justice. A miscopied number could bankrupt a merchant or allow a tax to go unpaid. In Egypt, scribes recorded temple inventories and sacred texts, ensuring that rituals honored the gods in the correct order. In classical Greece and Rome, they copied philosophical treatises and legal codes that would later form the basis of Western thought. A single missing or altered word could change interpretation, meaning, or legal outcome. Accuracy was not just a virtue, it was a responsibility that shaped lives. Counting words, then, was far more than tedious bookkeeping. It was a safeguard against chaos. A scribe who miscounted risked not only personal shame, but the distortion of knowledge itself. In Jewish tradition, for instance, scribes meticulously counted letters in the Torah, believing that even the smallest error could render the text invalid. Colophons, marginal notes, and word counts were tools to preserve integrity across generations. This precision reinforced a culture of accountability, teaching that careful attention to detail is essential when transmitting knowledge. Yet, despite all precautions, the work was fragile. Parchment could warp, ink could fade, pages could be lost. Wars, fires, and neglect claimed countless manuscripts. Every surviving document is thus a testament not only to the ideas it contains, but also to the extraordinary patience and skill of those who copied it. Scribes were the unsung custodians of human memory, quietly ensuring that literature, law, and philosophy would endure. Beyond the practical, there was also a philosophical weight to their labor. To count every word was to recognize that language itself carries power. Each stroke of a pen preserved thought, each letter held meaning. Scribes understood that forgetting a single word could distort reality, change a ritual, or mislead a student of history. In this way, their discipline created a bridge between the ephemeral nature of human life and the enduring presence of written knowledge. Economically, scribes were essential as well. Manuscripts were expensive commodities, and patrons, from kings to temple officials, relied on the skill of scribes to protect their investment. Errors could have financial repercussions. A miswritten legal document could nullify property transfers. A miscopied contract could create disputes. The meticulous counting of words was thus a form of quality control, as much as it was a labor of care for posterity. As centuries passed, the invention of the printing press would transform the transmission of knowledge, reducing the reliance on manual copying. Yet even then, the principles established by scribes endured. Typography, page layout, and proofreading are modern echoes of the ancient discipline of counting words and verifying accuracy. The scribes' painstaking work laid the groundwork for the mass production of reliable texts, ensuring that books, once rare and fragile, could reach wider audiences without sacrificing fidelity. Reflecting on their labor, one cannot help but admire the patience, concentration, and dedication required. In a world without digital backups, without undo buttons, without spell check, the scribe worked knowing that human error could erase generations of knowledge. Each carefully counted word was a shield against forgetfulness, a testament to the enduring human desire to preserve thought, memory, and culture. And so, the legacy of the ancient scribe is not just in the texts that survive, but in the ethos they embodied, that knowledge is fragile, that attention to detail is vital, and that even the most ordinary, repetitive labor can carry extraordinary consequences. Every word counted, every line verified, became a silent yet profound act of preservation, ensuring that ideas could travel across time and space, from the hands of one careful scribe to the minds of generations yet unborn. As you consider the books on your own shelves, or the words on your screens, think for a moment of the long chain of human diligence behind them. The silent counting, the measured strokes, the eyes straining over parchment in dim light, these small acts of precision shaped the world we inherit. Perhaps, in appreciating them, we begin to understand that the most ordinary labor can leave an extraordinary mark on history. If you stroll through the remains of an ancient Roman city, you might notice the faint outlines of public latrines, long stone benches with holes, and channels beneath them designed to carry waste away. These were not just functional spaces. They were social spaces, regulated by customs, expectations, and in some cases, formal rules. Toilets in Rome were as much a reflection of civic organization as aqueducts, amphitheaters, or baths. Public latrines were common in cities, often placed near forums or baths. They could seat a dozen or more people at once, stone slabs lined with regularly spaced holes, with a flowing water channel below. In these shared spaces, Romans conducted the most ordinary of bodily functions, side by side, engaging in conversation or silent observation. The experience was communal in a way modern private bathrooms rarely are, and it demanded a set of social norms. Privacy was minimal, and etiquette mattered. Loud or disruptive behavior was frowned upon, while sharing sponge sticks for cleaning, called tessoria, followed unspoken rules of hygiene and rotation. Beyond etiquette, there were regulations aimed at sanitation. Some city authorities fined those who defecated outside designated areas. Public latrines were connected to sophisticated sewer systems, such as the Cloaca Maxima in Rome, which drained waste into the Tiber River. The city's planners understood that controlling where people relieved themselves affected public health. In a densely populated city, unchecked waste could lead to outbreaks of disease, contamination of water supplies, and general decay. Law, hygiene, and urban planning intersected at these stone benches. Private toilets, often attached to wealthy homes, reflected status as well as practicality. Smaller than public facilities, they usually had a seat, a water channel, and sometimes even a small garden or view. These private conveniences allowed elite Romans a measure of privacy, but also demonstrated their sophistication. They often included decorative mosaics or inscriptions, turning what might seem a mundane function into a statement of refinement and order. Cleaning methods were carefully structured. The famous tessorium, a sponge on a stick, was rinsed in a bucket or running water, and in some cases salted or soaked in vinegar to prevent disease. Shared among users, it relied on communal responsibility and an understanding of hygiene practices. Despite modern assumptions, Romans were attentive to cleanliness in these spaces, balancing practicality with social conventions. Even the timing of use could carry significance. Latrines near baths encouraged people to combine hygiene routines, bathing, defecation, and socialization in one trip. Bathhouses were centers of leisure, business, and gossip, and toilets became extensions of these networks. A citizen might discuss politics, trade, or family matters while seated on a stone bench, fully aware that proper conduct was expected. Yet, despite their sophistication, questions remain. How much of Roman sanitation was genuinely effective at preventing disease? How did common people negotiate hygiene in crowded insular Syrax apartment buildings with limited facilities? And how did these ordinary routines influence social interactions, health, and urban planning in ways that might surprise us today? Rome's toilets were thus more than plumbing. They were a mirror of civic life, illustrating how ordinary, repetitive acts intersected with law, engineering, and social norms. And as we examine these spaces, we begin to see that even the most mundane human behaviors carry complex implications, shaping culture, health, and community in ways often overlooked. In ancient Rome, using a public latrine was as much a social ritual as a bodily necessity. Citizens seated themselves on long stone benches, often shoulder to shoulder, and engaged in quiet conversation or casual gossip. Unlike modern bathrooms, there were no partitions, and the lack of privacy demanded awareness of manners. Loud noises, staring, or any breach of decorum was considered rude. A Roman citizen who ignored these subtle codes risked social embarrassment, and in some cases, mockery from neighbors. The latrine was thus a classroom in civility, teaching lessons about shared space, respect, and the rhythms of communal life. Maintenance was equally structured. Latrines were cleaned regularly, often by slaves or specialized attendants, who scrubbed stone seats, cleared channels, and ensured that water flowed continuously to carry waste away. This water often came from aqueducts, demonstrating Rome's sophisticated understanding of urban engineering. The flow of water beneath the benches was crucial. A stagnant channel would quickly lead to odors, disease, and dissatisfaction among citizens. Some latrines even had drainage to nearby rivers, showing that city planners understood the importance of removing waste efficiently from public spaces. Hygiene practices extended to tools like the tessorium, the shared sponge on a stick. After use, sponges were rinsed in flowing water, sometimes salted or soaked in vinegar to prevent the spread of bacteria. While modern readers may find this practice unsanitary, in the context of the time, it represented a conscious effort to manage communal health. The Romans recognized that waste management was not only a technical problem, but a civic responsibility. Sanitation was also political. Public latrines symbolized the power and organization of the city. Wealthy citizens could demonstrate status by building or funding luxurious facilities, often with marble seats, mosaics, or decorations. Political leaders invested in sanitation projects to show concern for public welfare, recognizing that clean streets and functioning latrines were tied to civic pride. Indeed, the state's ability to manage waste could affect public perception, prevent unrest, and even protect against disease outbreaks. The use of toilets could also reinforce social hierarchies. While public latrines were accessible, the wealthy often maintained private facilities within their homes. Slaves and attendants managed these private spaces, cleaning them and ensuring their functionality. Meanwhile, the general populace relied on public conveniences, learning both the limits of privacy and the importance of cooperation in shared spaces. The latrine thus reflected a microcosm of Roman society, a mix of communal interaction, social etiquette, and structural inequality. Yet, even with advanced engineering, questions linger. How did the Romans cope with population growth in crowded insulae, where multiple families shared limited facilities? Did the rules of etiquette prevent conflict entirely, or were disputes over space, hygiene, or shared sponges common? And how did these ordinary routines, using, maintaining, and regulating toilets, affect the larger dynamics of urban life, health, and governance? Roman latrines, in their mundane yet highly organized existence, reveal a civilization deeply concerned with the management of ordinary human needs. They show that even the most routine aspects of life, sitting, defecating, and cleaning, can have profound implications for social cohesion, engineering, and civic administration. In this way, the Roman toilet was more than plumbing. It was a reflection of a city's structure, priorities, and attention to the seemingly boring details that kept urban life functional. Public sanitation in ancient Rome was a delicate balance of engineering, social custom, and civic oversight. Latrines, aqueducts, and sewers were not mere conveniences. They were essential infrastructure that supported public health and urban stability. Cities without functioning waste management faced disease outbreaks, foul odors, and social unrest. Rome's investment in sewage systems, like the Cloaca Maxima, illustrates how the management of bodily waste became a cornerstone of governance. As crucial as taxation or law enforcement, health concerns were central to these efforts. While Romans did not understand germ theory, they observed correlations between filth and disease. Streets lined with waste or stagnant water were avoided, while flowing water and clean latrines encouraged use and reduced complaints. Latrines, baths, and public fountains collectively served as preventive measures against the spread of illness. By attending to these mundane needs, city planners and officials mitigated risks that might otherwise destabilize dense urban populations. The social dynamics of latrines also reveal subtle layers of Roman society. Shared toilets demanded cooperation, patience, and etiquette. They functioned as social spaces where conversations occurred, deals were discussed, and news was exchanged. The unglamorous act of relieving oneself became embedded in the rhythms of community life. By enforcing etiquette, maintaining cleanliness, and providing regular oversight, authorities subtly reinforced civic norms and expectations. Maintenance of these facilities required constant attention. Stone benches needed cleaning, channels needed unclogging, and sponges required care. Slaves, attendants, or municipal workers performed the repetitive labor that allowed the city to function smoothly. These boring tasks, largely invisible in historical records, were critical to Rome's success. Without them, public spaces would have become unusable, citizens frustrated, and urban life disrupted. The political significance of sanitation should not be underestimated. By funding public latrines, wealthy patrons demonstrated their benevolence and concern for communal well-being. City officials who oversaw sewage and latrines gained credibility, while failures in sanitation could provoke public discontent. In essence, toilets became symbols of civic responsibility, linking ordinary human needs to the power and authority of the state. Yet questions linger. How did ordinary citizens perceive these spaces beyond mere functionality? Did familiarity breed comfort, embarrassment, or both? How did shared experiences in such intimate settings influence trust, gossip, and social networks? Even in the absence of written commentary on etiquette, we can infer that these routines shaped community bonds, norms, and expectations in subtle but meaningful ways. Rome's toilets, though mundane, reveal a civilization attuned to the practicalities of urban life. They show that attention to small, routine acts, waste management, hygiene, and shared norms can have profound implications for health, order, and social cohesion. The careful engineering, disciplined maintenance, and codified etiquette of Roman latrines offer insight into how societies manage the ordinary necessities that sustain extraordinary civilizations. In the modern world, we take indoor plumbing, sewage systems, and private bathrooms for granted. Yet the Roman experience reminds us that the management of ordinary bodily functions is deeply tied to public health, engineering, and social order. The next time you flush a toilet or use a clean restroom, consider the centuries of experimentation, labor, and civic planning that made such conveniences possible. A reminder that even the most mundane details of life can have enduring historical significance. In the quiet halls of medieval monasteries, monks bent over parchment, quills in hand, meticulously documenting the passage of days, months, and years. These entries, known as annals, recorded everything from the mundane to the seemingly trivial weather patterns, crop yields, deaths of local citizens, visits from nobility, and occasionally a significant battle or royal decree. To modern readers, the entries might appear tedious, repetitive, and uneventful. Countless lines of, "In this year it rained much," or "Abbot John died and was succeeded by Brother Peter." Yet these boring records were far more consequential than they appear. The monk's motivation was both practical and spiritual. Time in the medieval worldview was cyclical and sacred. Chronicling events, even ordinary ones, reflected the divine order of the universe. Every snowfall, drought, or feast day was a marker of God's plan, and writing it down preserved the memory of his work on earth. Accuracy, regularity, and completeness were prized over dramatic storytelling. The annals were not meant to entertain, they were instruments of devotion, discipline, and record-keeping. The daily routines of these scribes were disciplined and repetitive. Early in the morning, before prayers, they would review previous entries and prepare materials for writing. Ink was painstakingly prepared from soot, oak galls, or other natural sources. Parchment or vellum was stretched and scraped until smooth, ready to receive each careful stroke of the quill. Each entry demanded attention, not only to detail but also to chronology and consistency. Mistakes could confuse future readers or misalign the sequence of events, so corrections were made with careful annotations or marginal notes. The boring nature of the entries had its own value. By recording everyday events, who sowed which field, which abbey received a donation, which monk fell ill, monks created a detailed picture of medieval life that would otherwise be invisible to history. Scholars today rely on these seemingly dull records to understand climate patterns, agricultural practices, demographics, and even the spread of disease. What appears boring on the surface is, in fact, a repository of critical data. Moreover, the practice of recording ordinary events reinforced monastic discipline. The repetitive work of annal writing trained the mind to observe, categorize, and prioritize. Monks learned patience and attention to detail, virtues essential for both spiritual and administrative life. The act of writing itself became a form of meditation, repetitive, structured, and focused, linking earthly events to the rhythms of prayer and devotion. Yet the annals were not purely mechanical. Occasionally, they hinted at drama or conflict, a local noble's dispute over land, a flood that destroyed a village, or a pestilence that struck cattle. Even when sparsely described, these entries offer glimpses of medieval crises, decision-making, and social structures. By embedding extraordinary events within a framework of ordinary daily life, the monks preserved the continuity of history, allowing future generations to understand both context and detail. And here lies a question that remains unresolved. If medieval monks devoted years to recording the ordinary, how did they decide what was worth writing and what was not? What events, unnoticed by these diligent scribes, have vanished entirely from history, leaving gaps in our understanding of the medieval world? In the quiet cloisters of medieval monasteries, life was organized around rhythm, repetition, and careful observation. Each day followed a structured schedule dictated by the rule of Saint Benedict or similar monastic codes, prayers, manual labor, meals, reading, and crucially, the chronicling of events. Among these duties, the writing of annals, yearly or even daily accounts, demanded both precision and patience. It was a labor of continuity, connecting past, present, and future through words painstakingly inscribed onto fragile parchment or vellum. A monk's workspace was modest but carefully prepared. A slanted wooden desk, called a lectern, supported sheets of parchment, while quills carved from goose feathers rested nearby. Inkwells held ink derived from soot, oak galls, or other natural substances, carefully mixed with water and binding agents to ensure longevity. The parchment itself required preparation, scraping, stretching, and smoothing to create a surface that would hold ink without bleeding. Each line, each letter was deliberate, measured, and consistent, reflecting both the monk's devotion and the importance of accuracy. Monks recorded events with a remarkable focus on the ordinary. Weather patterns were noted meticulously. In this year, it rained excessively during the sowing season, causing the barley to rot, or a harsh frost struck in March, killing the early vines. Crop yields, livestock counts, and harvest results were logged, because the monastery's survival depended on understanding patterns over time. A drought could be contextualized with years of previous weather observations, informing decisions about planting, storing grain, and distributing food. To modern readers, this may seem boring, but in a world without thermometers, meteorological satellites, or modern agriculture, these details were vital. Annals also recorded social and political events, though often with terse language. The death of a local noble, the arrival of a traveling merchant, or the movement of troops was documented with the same matter-of-fact tone as a failed harvest. While modern narratives celebrate drama and conflict, medieval monks emphasized continuity and reliability. The value of their records lay not in storytelling but in precision. By capturing events systematically, monks ensured that future generations would have access to accurate information about both ordinary life and extraordinary occurrences. The process was repetitive, but mentally rigorous. Monks often reviewed previous entries to maintain chronological consistency, ensuring that one year flowed seamlessly into the next. Margins were used for annotations, corrections, clarifications, or cross-references to other texts. Errors were corrected cautiously, sometimes by scraping ink from parchment or adding small notes to indicate amendments. Such care reflected a deep understanding of the fragility of written records. One miscopied date, one skipped line, or miswritten name could create confusion for historians, jurists, or fellow monks relying on these texts. Economic and administrative considerations also influenced the writing of annals. Monasteries were centers of wealth management, controlling lands, tithes, and resources for surrounding communities. By recording donations, disputes, or obligations, monks maintained a detailed ledger of rights, privileges, and responsibilities. A record of a gift of land, or the conditions attached to it, had legal implications. In this sense, the annals were both historical and functional, serving as instruments of governance as much as memory. Interestingly, the annals often combined monotony with the occasional dramatic event. Plagues, floods, famines, and fires were recorded, but always within the same factual style. In this year, a pestilence struck the village of X, killing many cattle and some humans, reads one typical entry. Even extreme events are rendered in the same tone as the weather or crop yields. Reflecting the monastic mindset, the extraordinary was observed, but not sensationalized. Discipline, detachment, and order were the guiding principles, and each entry reinforced the rhythm of communal life. The monks' work had subtle social effects as well. While the annals appear impersonal, they reveal priorities, values, and perceptions of the time. They show which events were significant to the community and which were overlooked. Every recorded incident represents a choice, what was deemed worth preserving, and what faded into silence. By focusing on seemingly mundane occurrences, monks created a detailed tapestry of everyday life, allowing historians centuries later to reconstruct climate patterns, agricultural practices, mortality rates, and social hierarchies with remarkable precision. Their labor also reinforced spiritual discipline. Writing became a meditative act, a form of devotion. By engaging in repetitive, meticulous record-keeping, monks trained their minds for attention, focus, and humility. Each small entry, no matter how trivial, was a prayer in action, a recognition of God's providence in the unfolding of ordinary life. The discipline of annal writing mirrored the monastic rhythm of prayer, work, and contemplation, binding the spiritual and the practical in a single daily task. Yet the work was not infallible. Human error, limited perspective, and selective judgment meant that some events were exaggerated, others omitted, and some lost entirely. Monks were bound by the limitations of observation and experience. They could only record what they saw or were told. Even so, their diligence preserved knowledge that would otherwise have vanished. Every line, every word, was an act of stewardship, bridging generations and ensuring continuity in a world often disrupted by war, famine, and political instability. And so we are left with a question. If medieval monks devoted their lives to the methodical recording of the ordinary, How many voices, experiences, and events were lost simply because they were not considered worth writing? How much of human life remains invisible in history, hidden in gaps between the painstaking lines of annals? When we look at medieval annals today, it is tempting to dismiss them as tedious, repetitive chronicles of trivial matters. Yet, the significance of these writings cannot be overstated. Each entry, whether noting a harsh winter, a minor theft, or the death of a local official, was a deliberate act of preservation. Monks understood that history is not solely composed of battles, kings, or cataclysms. It is also woven from the mundane, the everyday, and the apparently insignificant. Without such records, the texture of medieval life, the rhythms of seasons, the ebb and flow of community, the patterns of agriculture and labor, would be lost to us entirely. The labor of writing annals was both spiritual and civic. Monks operated under the belief that recording events was a form of devotion. By observing and documenting the world with precision, they were acknowledging the order and providence of God. At the same time, these entries served as administrative tools. Records of donations, tithes, construction, and mortality were critical for managing monastic estates and asserting legal claims. In this way, annals fulfilled a dual purpose. They preserved collective memory while ensuring practical governance. The meticulous, almost obsessive, attention to detail in annal writing had unintended but lasting consequences. By capturing ordinary events, monks created a continuous chain of data that modern historians can analyze for climate patterns, population trends, and economic cycles. For example, repeated notes of harsh winters across decades allow climatologists to reconstruct historical weather patterns. Similarly, records of plagues, famines, or livestock deaths offer insight into the health and resilience of medieval communities. What may have seemed boring to the monks themselves has become invaluable to understanding the past. The discipline required to maintain annals also speaks to broader cultural values. Patience, precision, and attentiveness were elevated as virtues, and the act of recording daily life reinforced social cohesion. Monks became gatekeepers of memory, ensuring that the continuity of community and tradition could withstand the chaos of the outside world. In a period often marked by violence, political instability, and scarcity, such consistency provided a sense of order and reliability. The boring nature of their work was precisely what made it enduring and trustworthy. Yet, as thorough as these annals were, they also illustrate the fragility of historical memory. Monks could only record what they witnessed or were told. Entire perspectives, those of women, peasants, or marginalized groups, often remained absent. Some events deemed unimportant or morally irrelevant by the monastic chroniclers vanished entirely. In this way, the annals reveal not only the value of meticulous recording, but also the inherent biases and limitations of historical preservation. What survives is a filtered memory, shaped by human judgment, devotion, and priorities. The impact of annals extends beyond their immediate historical function. They influence later chronicles, legal documents, and historiography. The practice of daily or yearly recording established the precedent that even ordinary events matter, setting the foundation for systematic historical writing. By emphasizing consistency, accuracy, and detail, medieval monks contributed to a long lineage of documentary tradition, ultimately shaping how history itself is conceptualized as a continuum of events, both extraordinary and mundane. From a modern perspective, there is a profound lesson in the discipline of annal writing. In a world saturated with information, we often overlook the significance of small, repetitive acts, data collection, note-taking, or record-keeping, that accumulate over time to create meaningful knowledge. The monks' boring entries remind us that history, memory, and understanding are built not only from dramatic moments, but also from the careful attention to ordinary life. Each line, each date, each trivial detail is a thread in the larger tapestry of human experience. Ultimately, the annals are a testament to patience, diligence, and the enduring value of observation. They remind us that the act of recording, of taking time to notice, document, and preserve, is a powerful tool for shaping collective memory. As we consider our own lives, digital records, and daily routines, we might ask which of our seemingly ordinary actions today will become the source of insight for future generations. What will survive, and what will be lost to time, simply because someone did or did not take the effort to write it down. The monks' boring annals, with their endless lists, weather reports, and catalogued deaths, may appear dull at first glance, yet they reveal a profound truth: attention to detail, consistency, and care in recording even the most ordinary aspects of life ensures that history endures. Through their labor, the seemingly insignificant became invaluable, and the silent work of countless scribes has allowed us to peer into a world that would otherwise be irretrievably lost. In the grand halls of Renaissance Europe, amidst the flickering candlelight and the scent of polished wood and aged parchment, an unusual obsession was quietly taking shape. Wealthy nobles, scholars, and merchants began to amass collections of objects that were not necessarily beautiful or practical, but profoundly intriguing. These were the early Wunderkammern, or cabinets of curiosity, a precursor to the modern museum. Within these wooden cabinets, glass cases, or even entire rooms, one could find an astonishing assortment: fossils shaped like dragons, shells from distant oceans, preserved insects, exotic coins, intricate scientific instruments, and anatomical specimens. The act of collecting was not purely decorative. It was an intellectual exercise, a way of cataloging the known world, understanding the natural order, and asserting mastery over knowledge. Collectors were often deeply meticulous, recording provenance, dimensions, and sometimes even hypothesizing about the origins or significance of their objects. A butterfly pinned carefully in a cabinet was not simply a display, it was a specimen to study, to compare, and to reflect upon. A piece of coral from the Indian Ocean might be admired for its beauty, yet it also represented the reach of global trade and exploration. The objects themselves were often bizarre, mundane, or seemingly trivial to modern eyes, but each held meaning for the collector. A coin might reflect a distant kingdom. A curiosity from the New World might symbolize the expanding horizons of Europe, and a strange fossil could spark debates about the origins of life. Every item was catalogued with painstaking attention. Monograms, sketches, and handwritten notes accompanied objects, creating an intricate map of knowledge, wonder, and obsession. The social function of collecting was significant as well. Displaying a cabinet of curiosity was a demonstration of status, intellect, and taste. Visitors would be invited to view the collection, engage in discussions about rare or mysterious objects, and marvel at the collector's ability to gather such treasures. In this sense, cabinets served as both private laboratories of knowledge and public stages of prestige. The meticulous care in cataloging, organizing, and presenting each object was a performance in itself, a subtle assertion of social and intellectual authority. Collectors also developed specific practices to preserve and maintain their objects. Minerals were polished, insects mounted, manuscripts protected from humidity, and curiosities labeled with painstaking detail. Even the seemingly mundane, dusting, repairing broken shells, or stabilizing delicate artifacts, required constant attention. The labor was repetitive and exacting, but it ensured that the collection could endure over years or decades. In a period before mass-produced scientific instruments or climate-controlled displays, the survival of knowledge depended on careful, daily maintenance. The obsession with detail often extended to cataloging systems. Some collectors organized objects alphabetically, others by perceived natural order, geography, or symbolic meaning. Sketches and written records accompanied nearly every piece, reflecting the collector's desire not only to possess, but also to understand. The act of counting, measuring, and categorizing, boring to an outsider, was the essence of Renaissance curiosity, transforming random objects into a coherent worldview. Yet, the collections also contained elements of mystery and uncertainty. Oddities and anomalies, unidentified shells, fossils of unknown origin, or deformed animal specimens, sparked debate. Were they natural wonders, divine signs, or evidence of mythical creatures? Scholars and collectors argued, hypothesized, and sometimes fabricated explanations, blending empirical observation with imagination. The line between knowledge and speculation was thin, and this tension drove intellectual inquiry, even when the subject seemed trivial or mundane. The boring nature of cataloging, measuring a shell, sketching a fossil, labeling a coin, belied its profound significance. Through meticulous documentation, collectors preserved information that would later inform natural history, biology, archaeology, and geology. What appeared as obsessive, repetitive, or trivial work became a cornerstone of systematic study. These cabinets of curiosity transformed personal obsession into enduring knowledge, bridging the Renaissance fascination with exploration, art, and science. And yet, questions linger. How did collectors decide which objects were worthy of inclusion and which were discarded? How many items, unnoticed or undervalued, have been lost to time, their stories forgotten? What can these curious cabinets tell us about the mindset of the Renaissance, where wonder, obsession, and meticulous detail intertwined in the pursuit of understanding? Renaissance collectors approached their cabinets with the diligence of both scholars and caretakers. Each object was subjected to careful examination, shells were measured, labeled, and compared, coins were catalogued according to origin and error, insects were pinned and spread with precise attention to wing patterns, and minerals were polished and annotated. The process was repetitive and painstaking, often consuming entire days, yet it was considered essential. To overlook details could result in the misclassification of a specimen, or the loss of valuable information about the natural world. Collectors developed sophisticated systems for organizing their acquisitions. Some arranged items according to perceived natural order, grouping animals, minerals, and plants together to reflect the hierarchy of creation. Others catalogued objects geographically, demonstrating their awareness of distant lands and global trade networks. Manuscripts and letters often accompanied physical objects, providing context, provenance, or explanations that transformed a random curiosity into a coherent narrative. The act of cataloging, seemingly mundane, was a fundamental aspect of knowledge production, turning private fascination into structured information. Preservation was another area demanding constant attention. Environmental factors threatened the longevity of delicate objects. Humidity could warp parchment, sunlight could fade pigments, and insects could destroy fabrics or preserved specimens. Collectors employed ingenious strategies to mitigate these risks, storing items in carefully designed cabinets, using chemicals or oils to preserve organic materials, and maintaining detailed logs of condition and care. In this laborious work, the line between obsessive hobbyist and proto-scientist blurred. The boring tasks of dusting, polishing, and monitoring were essential for ensuring that collections remained usable and informative for future study. Social dynamics played a crucial role in shaping collections. Visitors, scholars, and patrons would often be invited to examine a cabinet, providing both critique and acclaim. The display of rare objects was a form of intellectual performance, showcasing the collector's reach, erudition, and taste. Yet, behind the public presentation lay a private world of obsessive study. Collectors debated the origins, functions, and meanings of their objects, sometimes corresponding with distant scholars to verify information or acquire comparative examples. These discussions fueled early scientific thought and encouraged systematic inquiry, even when grounded in curiosity rather than formal experimentation. The Renaissance obsession with classification also reflected broader intellectual trends. Humanists sought to organize knowledge, emphasizing empirical observation and critical inquiry. Collectors, through meticulous attention to seemingly trivial details, mirrored this pursuit. They challenged assumptions, questioned the nature of anomalies, and sought to understand the order underlying apparent chaos. Whether debating the provenance of a fossil or the taxonomy of an exotic shell, collectors engaged in early forms of scientific reasoning, blending observation, record, keeping, and imaginative hypothesis. Yet uncertainty persisted. Many objects defied explanation. Distorted fossils, unusual animal specimens, or artifacts from far-off lands sparked speculation and debate. Some were wrongly interpreted as evidence of mythical creatures or divine intervention, revealing the limits of contemporary knowledge. The very act of engaging with the inexplicable, recording it, comparing it, and theorizing, was part of the intellectual rigor of collecting. These debates, although sometimes fanciful, laid the groundwork for more systematic approaches in later centuries. The laborious repetition inherent in collecting, measuring, cataloging, annotating, may seem dull, but it was crucial for knowledge transmission. By maintaining detailed records, collectors ensured that objects could be studied systematically, compared across collections, and referenced in future research. Without this painstaking attention, many discoveries would have remained anecdotal, ephemeral, or entirely lost. The boring details were the scaffolding that supported larger intellectual achievements. And yet, questions remain: how much of what was collected has vanished, misclassified, or remained inaccessible? How did collectors decide which anomalies merited study and which were dismissed? And perhaps most intriguingly, how did their obsessive practices influence not only the content of knowledge, but also the very way Europeans conceptualized nature, art, and the boundaries of the known world? In exploring these cabinets, we see that Renaissance obsession was not mere eccentricity. It was a disciplined, repetitive, and deliberate engagement with the material world. Each careful annotation, each measured specimen, each painstakingly preserved object contributed to the gradual construction of a more ordered understanding of reality. What appears trivial on the surface, the act of cataloging, cleaning, or arranging, was, in fact, the foundation of systematic thought, bridging wonder and reason in the pursuit of knowledge. The cabinets of curiosity that adorned Renaissance homes and palaces were more than eccentric displays, they were incubators of knowledge. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, these collections had grown increasingly systematic. Collectors had learned that the value of their assemblages depended not only on rarity, but on accurate cataloging, careful preservation, and contextual understanding. Fossils were identified, shells compared to those from other regions, and minerals sorted by composition and origin. Even the most mundane tasks, measuring, labeling, dusting, and repairing, became integral to the process of knowledge building. Through these obsessive practices, Renaissance collectors laid the foundation for modern museums and scientific inquiry. The careful documentation of objects allowed later scholars to trace natural phenomena, track species, and study cultural artifacts. Without the meticulous attention to detail, much of the information we now take for granted about geography, biology, and art might have been lost. The seemingly trivial labor of labeling a shell or sketching a fossil became the scaffolding upon which empirical science would rise. Socially, the collections influenced culture, education, and intellectual exchange. Patrons and scholars visited these cabinets, observing and discussing objects, challenging interpretations, and sharing insights. A single artifact could spark debate, inspire curiosity, or generate new avenues of research. In this way, the Renaissance obsession with collecting transformed private curiosity into a shared intellectual pursuit, creating networks of knowledge that extended across cities and even countries. These interactions nurtured a culture of inquiry, experimentation, and careful observation that would characterize the scientific revolution. Yet there was also an aesthetic and philosophical dimension. Collectors appreciated the beauty, oddity, and symbolism of their objects, linking observation with contemplation. The act of arranging a cabinet required not only organization but discernment, deciding which items were worthy of attention, how they should be displayed, and how they related to one another. Even objects that seemed boring, a tiny fossil, a mundane coin, or a dried plant, were treated with respect, for they contributed to a coherent vision of the natural and human-made world. The meticulousness of Renaissance collectors also demonstrates the enduring value of repetitive, careful labor. Each annotation, each measurement, each sketch was an act of preservation. Without it, objects might have decayed, been lost, or remained misunderstood. The collections were living archives, combining observation, documentation, and interpretation into a structured whole. What may appear obsessive or tedious was, in fact, a sophisticated methodology for understanding the world. There is, however, an element of mystery and speculation that remains unresolved. Many collected objects were misidentified or misunderstood, interpreted through the lens of myth, superstition, or incomplete knowledge. Fossils were thought to be remnants of biblical creatures, exotic shells were mistaken for magical artifacts, and curious stones were believed to possess mystical properties. Yet even these errors were productive. They stimulated debate, encouraged further observation, and ultimately led to more accurate knowledge. The tension between curiosity, error, and insight is a hallmark of the process of discovery. The legacy of Renaissance collecting endures in modern institutions. Museums, scientific repositories, and libraries owe their existence to the painstaking work of early collectors who valued accuracy, preservation, and systematic documentation. Cabinets of curiosity evolved into curated collections, accessible to scholars and the public alike, transforming private obsession into shared cultural heritage. By valuing detail, repetition, and methodical care, Renaissance collectors demonstrated that the ordinary and the seemingly trivial can carry extraordinary significance over time. As we walk through contemporary museums, examining specimens, artifacts, and natural history exhibits, we are witnessing the echoes of centuries of patient, obsessive labor. The butterfly pinned carefully in a display case, the fossil labeled with exact measurements, the shell annotated with origin and notes, all reflect the dedication of collectors who understood that knowledge is fragile, cumulative, and deeply dependent on careful preservation. The boring details they recorded are precisely what make history intelligible, meaningful, and enduring. And so, The story of Renaissance collectors reminds us of a subtle yet profound truth: curiosity, rigor, and repetitive diligence are the engines of understanding. What may seem tedious or obsessive at the time often becomes the cornerstone of lasting knowledge. In every cabinet meticulously organized, every label carefully written, and every object preserved against decay, we find a legacy that continues to shape how humanity observes, documents, and interprets the world. In the bustling streets and workshops of 17th century Europe, economic life was tightly organized by guilds, associations of craftsmen, merchants, and tradespeople who governed every aspect of professional activity. These guilds were not informal clubs, they were legal entities with charters, bylaws, and hierarchical structures. From the blacksmith forging horseshoes to the cobbler stitching shoes, every trade had its own set of rules, meticulously enforced to maintain quality, regulate competition, and uphold communal standards. Guild laws were detailed, often seemingly trivial, but they had profound consequences for daily life. A shoemaker could not hire an apprentice without permission from the guild, nor could a baker sell bread that failed to meet specific weight or quality standards. These regulations extended beyond professional conduct. They encompassed pricing, production methods, work hours, and even the sequence of tasks. Violations could result in fines, suspension, or expulsion. To an outsider, the minutiae of these rules might seem boring or arbitrary, yet they ensured uniformity, trust, and economic stability within towns and cities. Membership was tightly controlled. To become a guild member, one had to complete years of apprenticeship, demonstrate competence, and often pay fees. Journeymen could travel to practice their craft, but remained bound by the laws of local guilds. Masters, who held authority over workshops and apprentices, were responsible not only for production quality, but also for transmitting knowledge, monitoring labor practices, and enforcing regulations. This hierarchical system ensured that skills were preserved, standards maintained, and economic power concentrated in a defined structure. Guild regulations also dictated social behavior, reflecting broader moral and communal norms. Many guilds required members to attend meetings, contribute to charitable funds, and participate in religious observances. Celebrations, processions, and even funerals of members were governed by codified practices. By embedding moral and social expectations into legal frameworks, guilds reinforced cohesion, loyalty, and shared identity among members. The boring, administrative details of dues, meeting attendance, or standardized processes were in fact essential for the functioning of these social and economic networks. The rules extended into daily production in ways both subtle and profound. A tailor, for instance, might be prohibited from cutting cloth in a certain way, or a brewer might be required to use specified ingredients and weights. These constraints ensured fairness, prevented undercutting, and protected reputations. Consumers, in turn, trusted guild-certified products, knowing that legal oversight and peer enforcement guaranteed quality. What might seem like obsessive regulation was in practice a sophisticated system of quality control and accountability. Guilds also served as centers of knowledge preservation. Masters taught apprentices not only techniques, but also the ethical and procedural norms of the trade. Written bylaws were supplemented by oral instruction, inspection routines, and records of prior disputes or decisions. This careful documentation allowed trades to maintain continuity over generations, even as the broader political and economic landscape shifted. Wars, plagues, or market fluctuations. The internal logic and rules of the guild provided stability, predictability, and a sense of order in everyday work. Yet, within this tightly regulated system, tensions often arose. How did guilds balance innovation with tradition? Were new techniques discouraged because they disrupted established norms, or were they eventually codified as standards? How did ordinary artisans navigate the bureaucracy of fines, inspections, and hierarchical authority while striving for personal success and recognition? These unresolved questions hint at the complex dynamics behind seemingly mundane rules, suggesting that even the dullest regulations carried stories of negotiation, compromise, and adaptation. The peculiar laws of 17th century guilds may appear tedious at first glance, specifying weights of bread, work hours, or apprentice duties. But they were essential to the economic, social, and cultural fabric of towns across Europe. They illustrate how attention to detail, enforcement of standards, and codification of routine behavior created resilient systems, shaping not only trades but also community life, trust, and continuity. Through these boring laws, we glimpse the hidden machinery that allowed urban life, commerce, and craft traditions to flourish amidst the turbulence of early modern Europe. And yet, one question lingers: how much innovation, creativity, or social mobility was constrained, or preserved, by these obsessive rules? How did ordinary people adapt, resist, or exploit the bureaucratic minutiae of guild life? And what lessons might these patterns hold for understanding structured systems today? Guilds were more than collections of tradespeople. They were self-regulating institutions with strict oversight. Enforcement of rules fell to masters and guild-appointed inspectors, often called deacons or wardens, who travelled between workshops, markets, and households to ensure compliance. Their duties were precise, methodical, and unrelenting. They measured cloth, weighed bread, inspected brewing vats, and verified apprentices' progress. Nothing escaped scrutiny. A single violation, substituting an ingredient, cutting a pattern incorrectly, or selling goods outside guild approval, could result in fines, public shaming, or temporary suspension. This system of regulation had a dual purpose. It maintained quality standards and reinforced social order. Guild laws functioned as both technical guidelines and moral codes, blending practical necessity with community cohesion. By following these rules, members contributed to a predictable and equitable system in which trust, reputation, and accountability mattered as much as craftsmanship. Violations were not merely procedural, they threatened the stability of the economic network and the social fabric of the guild itself. Inspections were meticulous, bordering on obsessive. Bread bakers had their loaves measured to the exact weight. Brewers were required to maintain detailed records of ingredients, and blacksmiths could be called upon to demonstrate uniformity in forging techniques. Inspectors documented every finding, often in notebooks or ledgers, creating official records of compliance and infractions. These records were carefully maintained and could be referenced in disputes or legal matters. In this way, the seemingly mundane task of measuring, counting, and recording became the backbone of guild governance. Disputes were inevitable, given the complexity of the laws. Apprentices might claim unfair treatment, journeymen could challenge masters' decisions, and merchants sometimes resisted regulations that restricted market competition. Guilds held tribunals or council meetings to resolve conflicts, relying on evidence, witness testimony, and prior precedent. Even minor infractions could be debated at length, illustrating the seriousness with which the guild approached governance. These boring, bureaucratic processes ensured consistency, fairness, and long-term stability, even if they appeared tedious or overly detailed to outsiders. Guild laws also shaped professional hierarchy and career progression. Apprentices were closely monitored, and their advancement depended on strict adherence to guild expectations. Masters gained authority not only through skill, but through knowledge of regulations and enforcement practices. Failure to comply could hinder promotion, reduce reputation, or even lead to expulsion. In essence, guild rules structured the very trajectory of a craftsman's life, intertwining personal success with communal norms and procedural rigor. Social and cultural norms were equally reinforced. Attendance at guild meetings, participation in ceremonies, and contributions to communal funds were mandatory, reflecting the integration of civic and professional life. Guilds promoted moral conduct, honesty in transactions, respect for superiors, and adherence to agreed-upon standards. By codifying these behaviors, guilds ensured cohesion and loyalty, reducing disputes and fostering mutual reliance among members. Even the boring details, meeting attendance logs, fee collection records, and lists of approved apprentices, served as instruments of cultural continuity. Yet, these rules also raised tensions. How did artisans balance creativity with rigid enforcement? Were innovations discouraged because they conflicted with existing regulations? Or were they eventually absorbed into guild standards? How did ordinary craftsmen navigate the interplay between authority, tradition, and personal ambition within these tightly controlled systems? These unresolved questions hint at the dynamic tension behind the boring minutiae of guild laws, revealing that everyday regulations carried complex social, economic, and cultural significance. Ultimately, the peculiar laws of 17th century guilds illustrate the power of structure, consistency, and attention to detail. By enforcing standards, monitoring behavior, and resolving disputes, guilds created resilient networks of economic and social stability. The daily work of measuring, inspecting, recording, and regulating, seemingly tedious, was fundamental to the functioning of urban life. Through these repetitive acts, guilds preserved knowledge, maintained quality, and shaped the professional and cultural landscape of early modern Europe. And yet, one question lingers: how did guild rules influence the long-term evolution of trades, markets, and urban culture? Did the obsessive enforcement of minutiae foster innovation, suppress it, or create a balance that shaped Europe's economic trajectory? By the late 17th century, guilds had become more than regulatory bodies. They were institutions that shaped the rhythm of urban life. Streets, markets, and workshops operated according to the intricate lattice of rules established by guilds. Ordinary citizens, artisans, apprentices, merchants, and consumers lived within this framework, often unconsciously guided by laws that determined how goods were produced, sold, and maintained. The seemingly boring repetition of inspections, fines, and record-keeping was, in fact, the engine of order, fairness, and continuity across towns and cities. The long-term impact of guild regulations extended far beyond individual workshops. By enforcing standards, guilds ensured that knowledge, techniques, and skills were transmitted faithfully from one generation to the next. An apprentice trained under a strict master learned not only the craft itself, but also the procedural discipline that governed its practice. These rules created continuity in production methods, ensuring that quality remained consistent across regions. When a consumer bought a product certified by a guild, they trusted the system. When a craftsman trained under guild oversight traveled to another city, they carried with them a set of practices and ethical norms that reinforced uniformity across broader trade networks. Guilds also influenced innovation, albeit in nuanced ways. At first glance, strict regulations might appear to suppress creativity. Artisans could not easily deviate from prescribed methods, use alternative materials, or experiment freely without guild approval. Yet, within these constraints, innovation often found subtle expression. Small improvements in technique, incremental design changes, or adaptations to local markets were documented, observed, and, over time, absorbed into guild standards. The system of meticulous record, keeping and repeated review thus provided a mechanism for regulated innovation. Changes could be trialed, observed, and eventually codified, blending experimentation with stability. Beyond economics and craft, guilds had profound social and cultural influence. Membership signified status, respectability, and inclusion within the communal framework. Social cohesion was reinforced through mandatory meetings, charitable contributions, ceremonies, and mentorship obligations. Guilds were intertwined with religious life, public celebrations, and civic responsibilities. Through these mundane but meticulously observed practices, attendance logs, fines, approved apprentices, and ceremonial duties, the guild maintained cohesion, trust, and continuity in society. The boring bureaucracy of guild law was essential for sustaining these networks. The documentation produced by guilds, records of fines, inspections, apprenticeships, and disputes, also became an invaluable historical resource. Modern historians rely on these records to reconstruct early modern economies, urban life, and social hierarchies, details that might have seemed trivial at the time. The precise weight of bread, the permitted dimensions of tools, or the schedule of inspections offer insights into how ordinary people lived, worked, and interacted. The obsessive attention to mundane details preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost, highlighting the hidden labor behind apparent societal order. Yet questions remain. How did guild rules shape the balance between conformity and individuality? To what extent did meticulous enforcement limit social mobility or reinforce existing hierarchies? How did ordinary artisans navigate the tension between personal ambition, creativity, and compliance with the rigid structures imposed by guild law? Even centuries later, these questions remind us that systems of rules, boring as they may seem, carry profound consequences for the lives of those subject to them. In the broader sweep of history, guild regulations influenced the trajectory of European trade, industry, and urban life. By institutionalizing standards, documenting practice, and enforcing discipline, guilds created a template for professional oversight and quality control. Modern regulatory frameworks, professional associations, and even certain elements of intellectual property law can trace conceptual roots to the meticulous practices of early guilds. The repetitive labor of enforcement, documentation, and rule-making, the details that might seem tedious, was in fact foundational to societal resilience, economic stability, and cultural continuity. Ultimately, the story of 17th century guilds teaches a subtle but enduring lesson: attention to detail, consistency in enforcement, and methodical record-keeping, even when seemingly boring, can create durable structures that outlast individual lives. The ordinary repetitive acts of measuring, inspecting, and documenting transformed everyday work into a system of accountability, trust, and long-term knowledge. Guilds remind us that civilization often rests not on dramatic breakthroughs alone, but on the steady, painstaking maintenance of standards, rules, and procedures. The peculiar laws that governed artisans and merchants centuries ago may appear dull at first glance, yet they shaped social, economic, and intellectual landscapes in ways that resonate to this day. In the smallest measurements, the most tedious inspections, and the strictest enforcement, we find the hidden architecture of early modern society, a reminder that even the boring minutiae of daily life can hold extraordinary significance. In the quiet, dimly lit chambers of Europe's early modern scholars, knowledge was pursued with an intensity that might appear obsessive, or even absurd, to outsiders. These men and women, often cloistered in private studies, libraries, or university rooms, devoted themselves to learning, writing, and preserving the intellectual achievements of past generations. Their lives were governed by repetitive routines, peculiar schedules, and habits that, on the surface, seemed mundane. Yet within these patterns lay the engine of discovery, preservation, and cultural transmission. A scholar's day began and ended with discipline. Many adhered to strict timetables, waking at dawn to read, copy, or annotate texts, taking short breaks only for food or prayer. Candles burned for hours, illuminating manuscripts as quills scratched across parchment. Ink was carefully prepared from oak galls, soot, or other natural substances, and quills were trimmed and shaped meticulously to ensure consistent writing. Even the preparation of tools, the cleaning of pens, the mixing of ink, the arrangement of books, was a ritual in itself, demanding patience and attention to detail. Repetition was central to scholarly life. Copying text by hand, for example, was not merely transcription, it was a form of engagement, memorization, and analysis. Every word was examined, every reference checked, and often marginal notes were added to record questions, observations, or connections to other works. Scholars created vast networks of annotations that could span hundreds of pages, each note a thread linking ideas, arguments, and sources. Modern readers might see this as tedious, yet it was essential for internalizing knowledge, detecting inconsistencies, and generating new insights. The peculiar habits of scholars extended to their physical environment. Desks were carefully arranged for efficiency, books stacked by subject, manuscripts spread for cross-referencing, and notes pinned or tucked to keep relevant passages visible. Some scholars used small wax tablets for temporary calculations or sketches, erasing and rewriting endlessly. Others maintained bound notebooks for longer reflections, slowly building a personal archive of observations, ideas, and hypotheses. The obsessive repetition of these routines might appear boring, but it created a system for sustained inquiry and intellectual growth. Diet and personal health were also regulated, often in ways that seem strange to modern sensibilities. Many scholars ate simple meals, bread, cheese, or porridge, to avoid distractions, fatigue, or indigestion. Some practiced rigorous schedules of sleep, exercise, or fasting, believing that bodily discipline enhanced mental acuity. Even seemingly minor habits, such as pacing while thinking, walking at specific times, or drinking herbal infusions, were tied to the pursuit of intellectual productivity. These practices illustrate the belief that the mind and body were deeply interconnected, and that ordinary routines could influence extraordinary achievements. Communication and collaboration took peculiar forms. Scholars often corresponded through extensive letters, exchanging observations, queries, and manuscripts with distant colleagues. These letters were drafted carefully, with attention to clarity, argumentation, and citation. Errata or corrections were noted meticulously, creating a chain of continuous dialogue across regions and generations. The boring labor of writing, copying, and circulating letters was, in fact, a cornerstone of the scholarly network, enabling the exchange of ideas in an era before printing and rapid communication. Yet, within the discipline of these routines, moments of eccentricity emerged. Some scholars developed unique filing systems, labeling texts and notes according to personal codes or mnemonic devices. Others engaged in ritualistic behaviors, arranging candles at precise angles, measuring hours with water clocks, or annotating calendars obsessively to track celestial or seasonal phenomena. To modern observers, these habits may seem trivial or even absurd, but they reveal the intense focus and methodical thinking that underpinned intellectual life. The productivity of early modern scholars depended on these repetitive, meticulous, and sometimes peculiar habits. Without them, knowledge could be lost, misinterpreted, or fragmented. Through painstaking routines, copying, annotation, and preservation, scholars bridged generations, transmitting classical learning, contemporary observations, and nascent scientific discoveries. Every boring, repetitive act, whether trimming a quill, cataloging a manuscript, or pacing while thinking, was a building block of intellectual continuity. And yet questions linger: which habits truly enhanced learning, and which were mere eccentricities? How did scholars balance obsessive repetition with creative insight? How many ideas were lost because they were never recorded with the same diligence? And perhaps most intriguingly, how does the quiet, methodical work of these scholars continue to shape the intellectual landscape we inherit today? The life of an early modern scholar extended far beyond the confines of the study. Though hours were spent in solitude, much of intellectual life was defined by communication with peers, mentors, and students. Letters served as the primary medium for debate, clarification, and the transmission of discoveries. Each letter was crafted with painstaking care. Arguments were structured meticulously. References to previous works were annotated precisely, and observations were recorded with attention to every detail. Even the paper chosen, the ink prepared, and the folding of the letter mattered, reflecting the scholar's dedication to order and accuracy. These networks of correspondence created an intellectual ecosystem that spanned cities, regions, and even nations. A scholar in Florence could exchange ideas with a colleague in Paris or a patron in London, forming a dialogue that transcended geographic and temporal boundaries. Each letter, note, and response contributed to cumulative knowledge, building upon prior observations and allowing errors to be corrected, theories refined, and new ideas to emerge. The process was repetitive, slow, and methodical, but it was foundational to the growth of early modern scholarship. Libraries were both sanctuaries and laboratories. Scholars arranged manuscripts, printed books, and notes with obsessive precision, often cataloging works according to personal classification systems. Some developed mnemonic devices or alphanumeric codes to cross-reference texts. Every annotation, margin note, and index entry reflected not only a desire to remember, but a conscious strategy to synthesize and connect disparate ideas. Walking through such a library was like traversing a map of knowledge, each shelf a node in a network of understanding that scholars painstakingly curated over years. Daily routines reinforced intellectual rigor. Many scholars divided their day into blocks of reading, writing, observation, and reflection. Experiments, whether alchemical, astronomical, or botanical, were performed at exact hours or under precisely controlled conditions. Some scholars measured temperature, humidity, or light intensity to ensure reproducibility. Others tracked celestial movements with meticulous logs. The repetition and attention to detail might appear tedious, yet it was essential for establishing credible observations and reliable data. The smallest oversight could compromise a study, making discipline and method a scholar's most valuable tools. Eccentric rituals often punctuated these routines. Scholars might pace for hours while contemplating arguments, perform specific gestures to focus attention, or engage in unusual habits to stimulate mental acuity. Some kept detailed journals of dreams or bodily sensations, linking physical experience with intellectual inquiry. Others annotated every book they owned with marginalia, sketches, and cross-references, creating labyrinthine maps of thought. These practices, strange to outsiders, reveal the ways in which methodical repetition, self-discipline, and attention to the mundane were harnessed to generate extraordinary intellectual output. The social dimension of scholarship extended to mentoring and collaboration. Apprentices, students, or junior scholars were taught not only subject matter, but also the routines, habits, and codes of attention that defined scholarly practice. Through observation and participation, they absorbed not only facts but the methodology of rigorous inquiry, careful note taking, precise citation, and systematic experimentation. The boring work of copying, cataloging, and maintaining texts became an apprenticeship in the art of disciplined thinking, ensuring the continuity of knowledge across generations. And yet, tensions persisted. How did scholars balance obsessive routines with creative insight? Did the repetitive nature of study sometimes stifle imagination? Or did it provide the scaffolding necessary for deeper thought? How much knowledge was lost to human error, neglect, or idiosyncratic practices? These unresolved questions suggest that even in the pursuit of intellect, The line between diligence and eccentricity, order and rigidity, was thin. By the end of the day, early modern scholars had woven a delicate tapestry of habit, correspondence, and observation. Their lives were structured, repetitive, and often peculiar, but these very characteristics allowed ideas to accumulate, be critiqued, and ultimately endure. What might seem tedious, hours of copying, cataloging, observing, or annotating, was, in reality, the engine of intellectual progress, preserving and transmitting knowledge in a world without instant communication or standardized records. As the 17th century progressed, the habits of scholars, meticulous, repetitive, and at times eccentric, left an enduring imprint on the intellectual landscape. Private studies, carefully maintained libraries, and extensive correspondence networks became the scaffolding for knowledge that would outlive individual lifetimes. By engaging in obsessive routines, scholars preserved texts, ideas, and observations that might otherwise have been lost to time, war, or decay. The boring labor of cataloging, annotating, and maintaining records created a continuity that enabled future generations to build on their work. The impact of these habits is evident in the evolution of modern libraries and archives. Cataloging systems, classification methods, and meticulous record-keeping developed by early modern scholars influenced the organization of printed books, manuscripts, and scientific data. The attention to detail in annotations, cross-referencing, and correspondence laid the groundwork for systematic scholarship, peer review, and academic standards that persist today. Every seemingly trivial habit, trimming a quill, arranging texts, noting observations, was a step toward creating enduring structures for knowledge management. Scientific inquiry, too, owes a debt to the obsessive routines of scholars. Observations in astronomy, botany, chemistry, and anatomy were recorded with such precision and consistency that they became reliable references for subsequent study. Early experiments required repeated trials, careful notation, and methodical verification, habits that echo in modern laboratory practices. The repetitive, disciplined work of these scholars demonstrates that intellectual breakthroughs often emerge not from sudden insight alone, but from persistent, systematic effort over long periods. Socially and culturally, these habits shaped scholarly communities. Correspondence networks, mentoring relationships, and collaborative projects established norms for intellectual discourse, debate, and critique. Scholars learn not only facts but also the art of careful observation, logical reasoning, and disciplined methodology. Apprentices absorbed both content and process, ensuring that intellectual traditions continued across generations. Even seemingly trivial practices, annotating margins, recording measurements, or pacing while thinking, were integral to the shared culture of scholarly rigor. Yet, the legacy of these habits also highlights human eccentricity. Scholars' obsessive routines often bordered on ritualistic, blending practical necessity with idiosyncratic behaviors. Some maintained peculiar schedules, bizarre filing systems, or unusual personal rituals that, while seemingly irrelevant, reinforced focus and cognitive organization. These quirks remind us that the pursuit of knowledge is as much shaped by human temperament as by formal discipline. The mundane and the peculiar, when combined with diligence, can produce lasting intellectual achievements. The story of early modern scholars teaches a subtle but enduring lesson: meticulous routines, obsessive attention to detail, and repetitive labor, although seemingly boring, form the bedrock of intellectual progress. What might appear tedious at the time becomes the foundation for long-term preservation, systematic inquiry, and cumulative knowledge. The quiet diligence of copying manuscripts, maintaining correspondence, and cataloging observations ensured that discoveries were recorded, debated, and refined, creating a resilient system of learning. In reflecting on these scholars, we see that the ordinary and repetitive can carry extraordinary significance. The quill scratched on parchment, the candle burned late into the night, the foot paced back and forth. All these actions, seemingly trivial, contributed to the vast edifice of human knowledge. Their habits remind us that progress is often slow, methodical, and painstaking, dependent on patience, rigor, and attention to detail. And so, the peculiar routines of early modern scholars continue to resonate in the libraries we visit, the research we conduct, and the intellectual traditions we inherit. Their disciplined, obsessive, and sometimes eccentric habits transformed private curiosity into collective understanding. They teach us that even the most mundane acts, when sustained with diligence, can leave an enduring mark on the world, shaping the ways we observe, record, and interpret knowledge today.